The humidity in the basement archive of the University of Eldridge felt less like air and more like a heavy, breathing shroud. Elias Vance, a PhD candidate who'd traded a social life for the dusty embrace of forgotten history, ran a damp cloth over a leather-bound journal. It was late, 3:17 a.m. by the glowing clock on his laptop, and the only sounds were the distant, erratic hum of the building's ventilation and the unsettling tap-tap-tap of a loose pipe somewhere down the hall. Elias was hunting for an obscure reference to a 17th-century cartographer named Alastair Finch. Instead, he found it wasn't marked with a call number or catalogued in the digital system. It rested on a shelf of misfiled, decaying atlases, nestled between a 1920s guide to taxidermy and a water-damaged book of Victorian poetry. It was a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, fashioned from a dark, unidentifiable alloy that absorbed the ambient light. It was cold to the touch, almost painfully so, like a chunk of frozen space. There was no lock, no hinge, no seam visible to the eye. It was a perfect, seamless monolith, except for one detail, a recessed, circular panel on the top, made of a foggy, glass-like material. Curiosity, the first deadly sin of the academic, tugged at Elias. He pressed the panel with his thumb, nothing that he tried a little more pressure, and then, a faint, almost inaudible click echoed in the small aisle. The metal box didn't open. Instead, the air around it shimmered, briefly distorting the rows of shelves like heat rising from asphalt. The faint light from the recessed panel began to pulse. It wasn't white, or yellow, or any color Elias could easily name. It was a color that seemed to unmake color, a deep, shimmering lavender mixed with a kind of visual static. Suddenly, his laptop, previously displaying a dry 188-page PDF, began to scroll rapidly on its own. Elias snatched it back, his heart now a frantic drum against his ribs. The screen stabilized, but the PDF was gone. In its place was a document he'd never seen, titled in a jarringly clean sans serif font, Chronos Compendium, Log 001. Elias read the first line aloud, his voice cracking in the unnatural quiet. Subject 7, male, early 20s, designated Elias Vance. Temporal signature, 3 hours 17 minutes and 41 seconds, November 3, 2025. Archival Sector B, 14, University of Eldridge. The details were exact. His name. His location. The precise time that he looked wildly from the screen to the cold, pulsing box that he read on, his breath catching in his throat. Initiation, 3 hours 17 minutes and 45 seconds. Note, the subject is observing the compendium at the moment of its reactivation. Prediction, immediate confusion, followed by intense, paralyzing fear at T+15 seconds, followed by compulsive reading. Elias looked at the time on his laptop, 3 hours 17 minutes and 58 seconds. He was 13 seconds into the prediction that a wave of icy, gut-wrenching dread washed over him, exactly as foretold. His hands began to tremble violently, and the box nearly slipped from his grip. Paralyzing fear. The compulsion to read was overpowering. He couldn't look away from the screen. The log continued, detailing the next 4 hours of his life, his movements, his thoughts, his decisions, including the precise route he would take out of the archive and the number of times he would stop to check over his shoulder. 3. It wasn't just a diary, it was a script. Then, he reached the final entry for the current time slot. Event, 7 hours and 5 minutes. Location, subject's apartment, 4A. Action, subject attempts to destroy the compendium with a heavy instrument. Outcome, failure. Observation, at this time, the subject will receive an encrypted communication from a source designated the Whisperer. The communication will contain a single, horrifying image that will definitively confirm the validity of the compendium's predictive capability. Elias frantically scrolled down the document, searching for the communication, for the image, but the rest of the file was corrupted, replaced by a looping string of code that looked like screaming faces. That he slammed the laptop shut. He looked at the Chronos Compendium in his hands. It was the most dangerous, most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. It was not predicting the future, it was writing it. That he needed to destroy it. Now. Before 07:05:00. He shoved the compendium into his backpack, ignoring the unnatural cold bleeding through the fabric. He rushed out of the archive, the loud thunk of the heavy steel door echoing like a death knell. He didn't look back, but as he reached the main hallway, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the loose pipe he'd heard earlier suddenly stopped. In the ensuing silence, a voice, dry and hollow as parchment, whispered from the empty, dark hall behind him, "For checks, Elias." 4. Elias froze, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He had only seen the log mention 3 checks. He turned, slowly, fear clutching his throat, and the empty hall lights flickered, casting a dancing, monstrous shadow that was not his own. The shadow seemed to hold something in its hand. Something that looked suspiciously like a heavy instrument. The whispering voice, brittle and dry, faded back into the institutional silence of the university hall, but the word, "for," reverberated in Elias's mind like a spent bullet hitting glass. The Chronos Compendium, log 001, explicitly stated 3 checks. The prediction was precise, clinical, and total. Yet, in the terrifying, immediate aftermath of its discovery, an unknown entity had already altered the script, changing 3 to 4. Elias didn't dare turn back fully. He bolted, sprinting down the marble hallway, the polished floor reflecting his panicked, blurred silhouette. His backpack, containing the impossibly cold metal box, thumped against his back like a captured, struggling heart as he stumbled out of the main building into the crisp, pre-dawn air. The streetlights cast long, sickly yellow cones onto the deserted campus green. Check 1. He stopped at the massive oak doors and looked back at the university's Gothic facade. The upper floor windows were dark, but he could swear the glass on the basement archive window, several stories below ground level, was shimmering with that unnatural lavender static light. Check 2. He reached his rusted Honda Civic. As he fumbled with the keys, he glanced over his shoulder toward the empty parking lot. He saw nothing, yet the feeling of being observed was crushing, as if someone were standing precisely 2 feet behind him, breathing the same air that he wrenched the door open, threw the backpack onto the passenger seat, and sped off. The log had predicted a precise route. Elias, driven by a desperate need for agency, took an immediate left, ignoring the right turn-only instruction in the log. He drove aggressively, blowing through 2 yellow lights, feeling a fleeting, defiant surge of victory. The relief was short-lived. His phone, resting in the cup holder, suddenly lit up. A banner notification, not from his GPS, but from his phone's native calendar app, popped up. Reminder. 14 minutes behind schedule. Continue straight on Elm Street, then turn right on Juniper Lane. Destination, apartment 4A. Time of arrival, 06:58:15. The compendium, or whatever was connected to it, wasn't just observing his predicted path, it was observing his actual path and correcting the schedule in real time, adapting the script to his rebellion. His attempt to deviate had only provided the script with a new, more detailed annotation. Check 3. Elias pulled into the traffic on Elm Street, heart still pounding. He glanced into the rearview mirror. Behind him, 3 cars back, was a plain, unmarked white van with tinted windows. It had been there since the start of Elm Street. A coincidence, he told himself, but the van mirrored his speed perfectly. He reached his apartment building, a dilapidated 4-story structure that smelled perpetually of old grease and wet paint. He parked, grabbed the Chronos Compendium, and practically flew up the 2 flights of stairs. The clock read 7 hours 1 minute and 40 seconds. He had less than 4 minutes until the dreaded 7 hours and 5 minutes event. He rushed into his cramped kitchen. The final entry of the log echoed in his mind: subject attempts to destroy the compendium with a heavy instrument. Outcome, failure. Failure was not an option. He grabbed the heaviest thing he owned, a cast-iron skillet, blackened and weighty. Placing the metal box on the counter, he raised the skillet high above his head. Before he could bring it down, the box pulsed violently, radiating that cold, lavender static. The light wasn't just visual, it was a physical force. It slammed into his arm like an invisible fist, sending the skillet clattering to the floor. He gasped, clutching his numb forearm. Failure. The compendium had defended itself, anticipating his precise method. 07:04:15 He stumbled into the living room, searching for another weapon, another option. He grabbed a heavy metal paperweight, a gift from his father. 07:04:50 He raised his arm, ready to smash the compendium sitting on his coffee table. 07:05:00 His phone buzzed. Not just a gentle vibration, but a harsh, grating electric hum that made the glass rattle against the wood. The whisperer. Elias dropped the paperweight. The fear was a cold, thick liquid in his veins. He snatched the phone. The notification was from an unknown number, a long, encrypted sequence of digits, and it contained a single attachment. He hesitated for a gut-wrenching second, then tapped the file. The image resolved on his screen. It wasn't a warning or a threat, and it wasn't a picture of him. It was a black and white photograph, grainy with age. It showed the basement archive of the University of Eldridge, the exact aisle where he had found the box. But the image was clearly from decades, perhaps a century, ago. Standing where he had been standing, leaning casually against the shelf, was a man in a waistcoat and spectacles. He was looking directly at the camera, a cold, indifferent smile on his face. The man was holding an open ledger, and on the top page of that ledger, clearly visible in the foreground, was the handwritten title, Chronos Compendium, Log 001. The accompanying text message from the whisperer was just 2 words, "You're late." Elias fell back onto the sofa, the phone slipping from his grasp. The man in the picture hadn't just predicted his future, he had recorded it, long ago. Elias wasn't the first subject. He was just the current entry in a very old, very meticulous log.as. The realization curdled in his stomach. The compendium on the coffee table gave one final, powerful pulse of lavender light. The box was no longer seamless. A single, razor-thin seam had appeared, running around the lid. It had unlocked, and from within the seam, a plume of cold, metallic-smelling vapor began to rise. Check 4. Elias instinctively looked up at the ceiling, not behind him. A noise, faint and scratching, was coming from directly above him, from the floor of the apartment directly above his, 4B. The neighbor, an elderly woman who never made a sound, was moving, and the sound wasn't of footsteps. It sounded like something being dragged. The scratching sound from apartment 4B above was slow, deliberate, and undeniably mechanical. It wasn't the sound of furniture being moved, it was the heavy, uneven drag of something metallic, punctuated by a faint, wet hiss. It wasn't human. Elias, frozen on his sofa, stared up at the ceiling. The Chronos Compendium sat on the coffee table, the lavender vapor now thicker, smelling strongly of ozone and rust. He knew he had to move, but the realization that he was a character in a centuries-old horror story had momentarily stolen his motor functions. The whisperer's message, "You're late," rang in his ears. Late for what? For his role? For his death, driven by a primal surge of adrenaline. Elias lunged toward the compendium. The box had opened only a razor-thin slit, but it was enough. He pinched the 2 halves of the alloy box and pulled, with a sound like tearing silk. The box yielded. The lavender light intensified, illuminating the entire living room in a disorienting haze. Inside, resting on a bed of crystallized, ancient velvet, was not a scroll, or a manuscript, or a microchip. It was a single, perfectly spherical object. An EYE.IT was impossibly large, about the size of a plum, with an iris that spun slowly, displaying a chaotic, miniature galaxy of black and white stars. It looked organic, yet it was constructed of fine, articulated brass wire and polished obsidian. It was a terrifying piece of clockwork. As Elias's hand hovered over it, a new line of text flashed onto his phone, overriding the current screen and displaying itself in stark white on a black background. Chronos Compendium log update. 7 hours 7 minutes and 30 seconds, Subject 7. Observation: the subject is contemplating the activation of the Oculus. Warning: activation releases the keeper. The word "keeper" seemed to echo in the dead air of his apartment. Simultaneously, the scratching sound from 4B stopped. A heavy, rhythmic thump started, directly over his head, descending along the wall. It wasn't dragging anymore. It was climbing down through the air ducts, or worse, through the structure itself. Elias had a terrifying flash of clarity. The Chronos Compendium was a lure. The script wasn't for him to read, but to perform for something else. The keeper wasn't a warning, it was a consequence that he looked at the mechanical eye. If he touched it, he would activate the final horror of the box. If he didn't, whatever was in 4B would break through the ceiling. That he made a desperate choice. Ignoring the Oculus, he grabbed the open compendium box and flipped it over, hoping to use the metal casing as a shield. Too late. A section of the ceiling plaster directly above the compendium suddenly cracked, not into a spiderweb pattern, but into a single, perfectly circular incision. The circle of plaster dropped, revealing a deep, black hole, and the metallic, musky stench of something ancient and corrupted flooded the room. And then, a hand dropped through the hole. It was unnaturally long, pale white, and seemed to be made entirely of bone and polished, black metal joints, like an antique automaton's limb. It was clutching something, a rusty, heavy-duty ratchet wrench. The heavy instrument Elias had failed to use. The metallic hand plunged down, not toward Elias, but toward the Chronos Compendium. It closed around the open box with sickening speed. A dry, wheezing voice whispered from the ceiling aperture, the same voice from the archive, but closer, clearer, and full of cold contempt. The script. It requires completion, Elias Vance. The keeper, or its hand, wrenched the compendium box upward. The box vanished back into the ceiling cavity. Elias scrambled back as dust and debris rained down. He was unarmed, his log stolen, and whatever was in 4B was now aware of his exact location. He looked down at the coffee table. The keeper had taken the box, but in the chaos, it had missed one thing. The mechanical eye, the Oculus, lay gleaming on the table. His phone buzzed again, one final message before the screen went dark, drained of battery power by the compendium's energy field. The whisperer. Don't let them close the loop. Look into the eye. Only a deviation can save you now. Elias knew the compendium had predicted his demise. He knew the keeper was following that script. His only chance was to introduce a true, unpredictable variable. He reached out and closed his fingers around the cold, slick surface of the Oculus. The moment his skin touched the brass and obsidian, the miniature galaxy in the iris exploded into a blinding white light. The world dissolved. The stench of ozone vanished, the hole in the ceiling was gone. Elias felt a violent, dizzying pull, and the last thing he heard, echoing from the void, was the keeper's dry, furious shriek. He broke the log. The blinding white light from the Oculus didn't just fade, it snapped out of existence, replaced by a sudden, jarring sensory onslaught. Elias gasped, choking on air that tasted like sulfur and wet concrete. He was no longer in his dilapidated apartment. He was standing in a vast, echoing space that felt simultaneously ancient and futuristic. The walls were towering sheets of dull, corroded steel, crisscrossed by thick, pulsating cables. The ceiling was lost in shadows, but the floor was perfectly clear, a massive, circular glass observation deck. Below the glass, stretching out into an endless, swirling crimson void, was a colossal, churning mechanism, gears the size of houses, immense clockwork running in a grinding, terrible sync. This was not a building, it was a time engine. The engine room, a voice hissed in his ear. Welcome to the central node. Elias spun around. Standing beside him was a figure he recognized instantly, the man from the old, grainy photograph. The one in the waistcoat and spectacles, the one who had written the first log. Alastair Finch, Elias whispered, recognizing the name of the 17th-century cartographer he was supposed to be researching. Finch didn't smile. His eyes, magnified by the lenses of his spectacles, held the same cold indifference as in the photo. A residual self-image, Subject 7. A ghost of memory trapped in the Oculus's travel signature. Think of me as a tour guide for the damned. Where are we? What is this place? Elias demanded, clutching the now inert Oculus. "This is the hub of the loop," Finch replied, his voice thin and paper dry. "The compendium doesn't predict time, Elias. It processes it. This engine keeps the timeline perfectly consistent. But consistency requires sacrifice, it requires subjects." Finch gestured to the glass floor. Elias looked down, his blood turning to ice. Embedded within the Titanic, grinding gears below were countless human figures. They weren't trapped, they were part of the mechanism, stretched and fused to the clockwork, their bodies serving as levers, counterweights, and the very teeth of the massive gears. They were all silent, their faces contorted in expressions of eternal, agonizing labor. "These are the failed subjects," Finch explained casually. "Subjects 1 through 6. Anyone who discovers the compendium and attempts to deviate. They become the fuel for the Chronos engine, ensuring the loop remains closed. Their sacrifice ensures the script is followed." The Keeper, Elias realized. The thing in 4B. It wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to reacquire the log. "Precisely," Finch confirmed. "The Keeper is the engine's maintenance mechanism. When a subject breaks the log, as you did by using the Oculus, the Keeper is deployed to retrieve the script and, if necessary, the subject, to put them back into the proper sequence." "But why? Why this elaborate script? What's the purpose of the loop?" Finch's expression finally shifted, a flicker of pure terror passing over his face. "The loop isn't for us, Elias. It's to keep IT out. The Keeper, its real title is the Keeper of the Threshold. It maintains the seal." As he spoke, the lights in the engine room flickered violently. The grinding sound below rose to a deafening, metallic shriek. "You've deviated too far," Finch hissed, clutching his head. "The engine is correcting. We don't have time. Listen carefully, the Whisperer is the only true ally. It's a localized temporal echo, a residual intelligence that wants the loop broken. It wants the seal opened." "Why would I want that?" Elias shouted over the noise. "Because the engine will grind you into fuel within the hour." Finch countered. The Whisperer's image, that wasn't a warning, it was an instruction. "Did you notice the year in that photo? It was 1925. I was Subject 3. My log predicted my fusion with the engine. The only way to break the script is to find where the Whisperer is transmitting from." Finch pointed a trembling finger toward the massive steel walls. "It's transmitting from a node outside this reality. A place where the rules are fluid. It's the only place the compendium can't write a script for. It's called the inversion point." The temperature in the room dropped instantly. A shadow fell over the glass deck. Elias looked up. The Keeper had arrived. It had descended from the ceiling, not through a hole, but through a tear in the steel plating. It was monstrously tall, skeletal, and covered in overlapping, polished segments of black iron that hissed with ozone. Its head was a brass sphere with a single, unblinking lens. And in its long, mechanical hands, it held the open Chronos Compendium. "Subject 7, the Keeper's voice boomed, a deep, resonating bass that rattled the glass floor. "Deviation is cancelled. Return to log 001. Time, 7 hours and 15 minutes. Destination, the engine." A new entry appeared on the blank pages of the open compendium in the Keeper's hand, glowing with an angry red light. 7 hours and 15 minutes. Subject 7. Action, assimilation into the Chronos engine. The Keeper took a deliberate, heavy step onto the glass deck. The glass groaned under its weight. "You have 5 seconds before it grabs you," Finch screamed. "Look into the Oculus. You must travel to the inversion point. Find the origin of the image." Elias didn't hesitate. He raised the Oculus, the mechanical eye, to his own eye level. As he stared into the swirling black and white galaxy, he focused on the single image he remembered, the grainy photo of Finch holding the log. He needed to go to that moment, to the source of the Whisperer's first communication. The keeper roared and lunged, its metallic claws tearing into the glass. Elias triggered the Oculus, the world dissolved again, but this time, the transition wasn't white light. It was a suffocating, grinding blackness, filled with the digitized screams of the failed subjects in the engine. The grinding darkness ended with a sickening lurch, and Elias found himself violently spat out onto a cold, hard floor. He scrambled to his feet, the Oculus, now warm and humming faintly, clutched tightly in his hand. He was in an apartment, but one utterly unlike his own. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and old paper. The walls were covered in heavy, floral wallpaper, and the furniture was dark, imposing Victorian mahogany. This was 1925. He was in apartment 4A. His apartment, but a century in the past. The room was illuminated only by the weak, gray light of a rainy dawn filtering through the window. The place was littered with instruments of cartography and clock-making, delicate brass tools, rolled-up maps pinned to the walls, and a large, partially dissected grandfather clock standing in the corner. And standing over a massive, antique desk, frantically scribbling into a ledger, was Alastair Finch. Not the spectral, residual self-image, but the living, breathing Subject 3, looking exactly as he did in the Whisperer's photo. Finch looked up, his face gaunt with exhaustion and terror. He wasn't surprised to see Elias. The Oculus. Finch breathed, dropping his pen. It worked. You followed the echo. You are the anomaly, Subject 7. I'm Elias Vance, he corrected, his voice rough. And I'm not a subject. Where are we, exactly? Finch, your ghost said this was the inversion point. It is the point where time folds back on itself, Finch explained, pointing to his desk. I discovered the compendium, just as you did. I panicked. I researched. I found a historical anomaly, a flaw in the timeline where a piece of the universe's memory was wiped. This apartment, at this precise time and day, is the center of that flaw. This is where the Keeper's script holds the least power. Finch gestured to the ledger. I was writing log 001. My own death script. But I realized, if I created an echo, a piece of data that transcended the engine's processing, I could breach the security. That image you received? The photo of me writing the log? That was the echo. I transmitted it into the future seconds before the Keeper caught me. The transmission drained the compendium's power, allowing the Oculus to function for a brief window, your window. You were the Whisperer, Elias realized. I am part of it, Finch corrected. The Whisperer is the collective residual intelligence of all who have seen the script, the subjects, the forgotten scholars, everyone who understood the horror of the loop. Its goal is the same as mine, to destroy the engine and escape the repetition. A faint, but growing, metallic scrape echoed from the floorboards beneath them. The Keeper is crossing the temporal breach, Finch hissed, grabbing a small, tarnished silver key from a drawer. It's coming for the compendium and you. We have moments. He rushed to the grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't ticking. Its inner workings were exposed, gleaming with unnatural, dark fluids. The Oculus, Finch said urgently. It's the key. The eye isn't a transporter, it's a temporal anchor. It stabilizes the flaw. When I activate this clock, it will open the inversion point completely, making a hole in the engine's reality. But it requires the Oculus to keep the tear open. And then what? Elias asked, moving to cover Finch. Then you jump through, Elias. And you find the core. Finch's eyes were wild, consumed by manic hope. The core is the source of the compendium's ink, the material that writes the script. If you destroy the core, you stop the writing. You break the loop. You save all of us. Finch inserted the silver key into a hidden lock inside the clock mechanism and turned it sharply. The apartment lights went out. The rain outside stopped instantly, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. Then, the silence was shattered by a sound that made Elias's teeth ache, the high-pitched, grinding shriek of metal on metal. The sound of the keeper, the wall behind the grandfather clock began to glow, not with the lavender light of the compendium, but with a vibrant, pulsating emerald green. The wall was liquefying, tearing open to reveal a swirling vortex of green and black, the inversion point. "Go! Now!" Finch yelled, pushing Elias toward the vortex. "The keeper is here. I will stall it. When it grabs me, you throw the Oculus into the vortex. It will anchor the tear." Suddenly, the front door of the apartment splintered inward. The keeper was framed in the doorway, taller and more terrifying in the gloom. It held the open log 001, the pages now flickering like burning paper, showing Elias's next action. "Subject 7, the keeper announced, its mechanical voice filled with fury. Do not deviate. The core is the threshold. It must remain sealed." The keeper lunged, not for Elias, but for Finch, seizing the older man's shoulder with its metallic claw. Finch gasped, his body instantly contorting as the keeper's touch began to fuse him, bone to metal, flesh to gear. "Break the loop, Elias." Finch screamed, his face a mask of agony. Elias hurled the Oculus with all his strength. The mechanical eye sailed across the room and plunged into the swirling emerald vortex. The vortex roared, expanding violently. The green light slammed into the keeper, briefly stunning it. Elias ran and dove headfirst through the tearing hole in the wall. He left Alistair Finch, Subject 3, to his fate, his final screams instantly consumed by the grinding roar of the inversion point closing behind Elias. The transition through the inversion point was not like the cold, clinical jump of the Oculus. It was visceral, agonizing, a sensation of being pulled apart into raw data and then crudely reassembled. Elias landed hard on a damp, yielding surface. When he opened his eyes, he realized he wasn't in a chamber or an engine room, but inside a massive, fleshy, organic space. The air was heavy, warm, and smelled sickly sweet, like decaying flowers and blood. The walls around him pulsed slowly, covered in a network of fine, iridescent veins that glowed with a faint, angry red. The floor was a dark, semi-liquid mass that squelched with every movement. He looked up. The ceiling was a grotesque dome of living tissue, from which thick, black fluid, the ink, dripped rhythmically. This was the core. Not a machine, but a biological entity. Elias quickly examined the Oculus, which had anchored the rift. It was embedded in the fleshy floor nearby, still pulsating with the emerald light of the inversion point, its brass casing steaming against the heat of the core's interior. He was in the belly of the beast. He pulled himself to his feet. Every surface he touched felt warm and adhesive. The silence here was different from the silence of the archive or the engine room. It was a pressurized, listening silence. "The source of the compendium's ink," Elias muttered, wiping a sheen of black fluid from his arm. He realized with a terrifying chill that this black liquid was not just ink, it was concentrated history. Every word of the log, every predicted event, was drawn from this putrid, living reservoir. As he moved, the floor beneath him rippled, and the red veins in the walls pulsed faster. Suddenly, a voice, a chorus of 1,000 overlapping whispers, erupted directly inside his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. "The script must be maintained. You pollute the source. Elias Vance, your sequence is corrupted." The voices were filled with profound sadness and immense malice, echoing the collective anguish of every timeline the core had consumed and processed. Elias stumbled back, covering his ears, though it did no good. "Who are you?" "We are the sum of all subjects. The data ghosts of those who resisted and failed. We are the ink, and we are the will of the loop." A large section of the fleshy wall in front of him began to swell and rupture. From the tear, a column of the thick, black ink surged out, solidifying instantly into a familiar shape, the body of Alistair Finch. But this was not the Subject 3 who helped him. This was a crude, grotesque recreation. Finch's face was molded from the viscous ink, his eyes were pools of swirling black liquid, and he was held together by strands of the same red, glowing veins that lined the walls. The keeper failed, the ink. Finch wheezed, its voice a hollow parody of the real man. But the core adapts. I was Subject 3. I am the most recent entry in the ink. I know your methods, Elias Vance. You're just a puppet, Elias spat, backing away towards the glowing Oculus. A puppet with memory, the ink Finch corrected, gliding towards him on the squelching floor. I know Finch told you to destroy the core. But where is the core? Where is the center? It raised an inky hand, and in the space between its thumb and forefinger, a perfect, miniature replica of the Chronos Compendium materialized, dripping with black fluid. The compendium is not the tool, Ink Finch continued, its voice dropping to a seductive, terrible whisper. It is the container for the ink's consciousness. You tried to destroy the box, you tried to smash the eye, but you never looked deeper. Ink Finch gestured with the miniature compendium toward a point directly above Elias's head, where the sealing tissue was throbbing with the greatest intensity. The source of the script is not the ink itself, but the need for the ink. The keeper maintains the engine, and the engine processes time, but something must tell the engine what to process. As the ink Finch spoke, Elias felt a change in the atmosphere. The heat was intensifying. The floor was growing more adhesive, pulling at his shoes. You seek to end the script? Ink Finch mocked, stepping closer. Then you must confront the writer. The figure lunged. Elias dodged, slipping on the inky floor. He sprinted toward the Oculus. He knew his only way out was to destabilize the engine, and the only way to do that was through the inversion point that he reached the mechanical eye just as Ink Finch's tendrils wrapped around his ankle. He grabbed the Oculus and pulled, but it was anchored firmly in the yielding, fleshy floor. You can't leave, Subject 7, the chorus of voices screamed in his mind. The ink needs you. Your story is the final piece. Elias yanked with desperate force. The Oculus ripped free, but as it did, a large piece of the organic floor tore away with it. The wound on the floor pulsed red, then began to bleed a viscous, pale yellow fluid that sizzled on contact with the black ink. The entire chamber convulsed. The voices in his head unified into one deafening, agonizing shriek. Elias had found the core's wound. Now, he had to find the source of its consciousness, the writer. He looked up, using the glowing Oculus to shield his eyes from the pulsing light of the ceiling dome, and saw a structure forming in the apex of the living space. That it was a vast, complicated structure, woven from bone-white cords and shimmering, crystallized tendons. And at the center of this grotesque neurological mass, suspended like a terrible, beating heart, was a single, immense organ, pulsing with the same lavender static he'd seen in the compendium box. That it was a brain, and sitting right on top of it, hunched over and writing furiously with a pen made of sharpened bone, was a figure. A figure that was undeniably the Whisperer. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The Whisperer wasn't his ally. It was the operator, the consciousness that exploited the core's biological processing power to write the Chronos Compendium. It was the writer, hunched over the colossal, throbbing brain, the core's neurological center, was a figure composed entirely of swirling, concentrated residual data, a shimmering, indistinct silhouette with the faint outlines of the waistcoat and spectacles of Finch, the modern clothes of Elias, and the archaic robes of Subject 1. It was a fusion of every subject's intellect, freed from the engine but bound to the core. The writer was scribbling at a maniacal pace, not in a ledger, but directly onto the surface of the massive brain, using the bone pen to carve glowing, lavender sigils into the tissue. He sees, the thousand-voice chorus screamed from the walls. Not he, the ink Finch wheezed, rapidly reforming its inky body and locking its gaze on Elias. It's the collective. The minds of all the failed subjects, released from the engine, and now trapped here, forced to write the script to keep the loop viable. The ink Finch rushed at Elias, its tendrils lashing out. Elias dodged, the Oculus burning in his hand. He noticed the ink Finch's movements were becoming erratic, as if the core's internal stability was compromised by the yellow fluid oozing from the wound. The yellow fluid. Elias shouted, realizing. What is it? Stabilizer, shrieked the writer from above, its voice a terrified, synthesized echo of all past subjects. The core is biological. It requires perpetual, absolute consistency. The ink is the toxin. The yellow is the countermeasure. You've wounded the core's membrane. Elias had a new, desperate plan. He wasn't trying to destroy the core, he was trying to overload it. You said deviation is required. Elias yelled at the writer. You sent me the echo. Why? The writer paused its manic carving, and its synthesized voice, momentarily clarifying into something that sounded painfully like Alistair Finch, replied, We want release, Elias. We want the engine to stop. But the core demands the log be finished. It demands a final, perfect entry. The writer raised the bone pen, pointing it directly at Elias. Your destiny is here, Elias Vance. You are the final entry. The ultimate deviation that closes the loop forever. The writer dipped the bone pen into the lavender glow of the brain's surface, and the entire chamber flared with light. A new wave of intense agony surged through Elias's mind. The final words of the script were being written, directed specifically at him. Inkfinch closed the distance. I will assimilate you into the final entry, Subject 7. Elias threw the Oculus, not at the Inkfinch, but at the enormous brain mass. The mechanical eye struck the massive neurological organ with a sickening thud, the brain convulsed, and the lavender glow sputtered. The writer shrieked in pain and rage as the Oculus, still humming with the emerald light of the inversion point, began to destabilize the organic processing unit. The Inkfinch roared and tackled Elias. They slid across the squelching floor. Elias was desperately fighting the sticky, powerful tendrils that were attempting to fuse him. He had to get more of the destabilizing agent, the yellow fluid, onto the core. Elias grabbed a sharp, broken bone fragment jutting from the floor, likely the remains of a previous subject. With a grunt, he plunged the bone shard deep into the floor where the yellow fluid was pooling. Inkfinch saw his intention and shrieked, "No!" The final act. Elias yanked the shard out, coated in the pale, sizzling fluid, and stabbed wildly at the Inkfinch's torso. The yellow fluid met the black ink. The Inkfinch dissolved instantly, not with a burst of power, but with a sickening fizz, leaving behind a pool of inert, steaming residue. With his enemy gone, Elias raced towards the core's immense brain. The writer, distracted by the Oculus's presence, was frantically trying to carve over the eye, hoping to integrate it. Into the script, Elias reached the pulsating core. He raised the bone shard, slick with the yellow fluid. I won't be your final entry, he yelled. He drove the bone shard deep into the brain mass, directly into the source of the lavender static, right next to the writer's hands. The core exploded, not a physical explosion, but a temporal one. The chamber ripped apart in a chaotic kaleidoscope of light and sound. Elias felt the familiar, terrible sensation of being stretched and torn, but magnified 1,000-fold. The screaming voices were deafening, a final, despairing cry of the collective. The writer's silhouette shrieked one last, clear word before being annihilated by the wave of raw, unstable time. Nemesis. The explosion of the core did not kill Elias, but it atomized reality around him. He wasn't falling, he was suspended in a swirling, kaleidoscopic void where gravity had no meaning and colors flickered too fast for the eye to track. He was adrift in the raw, broken machinery of time. Elias clutched the broken bone shard, now his only weapon, and felt a chilling shift. The agony of the voices was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it was almost deafening. He had shattered the script. Then, from the chaos, a massive structure began to coalesce around him, the Chronos engine. The colossal gears, previously seen through the glass floor, were now directly beside him, but they were no longer turning smoothly. They were grinding, seizing, and sparking with immense, blue-white energy. The destruction of the core had starved the engine of its ink, the command code, but the engine itself was a self-sustaining perpetual motion machine. It was failing catastrophically, but it was still running, and the keeper was here. It materialized from the geometric chaos, its black iron body now twisted and scarred by the temporal rupture, one of its mechanical arms dangling uselessly. It was still clutching the empty, smoking husk of the Chronos Compendium. Error. Log terminated. Core destroyed. The keeper's voice resonated, now fragmented and layered with static. Subject 7. Your deviation is initiating temporal collapse. I broke your loop. Elias yelled, floating closer to the malfunctioning engine. The loop is the seal, the keeper returned, its single lens focusing on Elias with cold, mechanical intensity. You did not free us. You freed it. The keeper lifted its good arm and pointed toward the core of the grinding gears. Elias followed the gesture. Embedded deep within the massive mechanism, where the fused bodies of the failed subjects had been, was a pulsing object. It wasn't the Lavender brain, it was a rough, black crystalline shard, a piece of history so hard and dense that even the engine couldn't fully grind it down. As the engine seized, the shard pulsed with a deep, furious crimson light, cracking the immense gears around it. That, the keeper stated, its voice laced with a strange, horrifying deference, Nemesis. It is the truth the loop was built to contain. The ultimate anomaly. What is it? Elias demanded. It is the original sin of time, the keeper replied. The moment before the loop started. It is a paradox that, if unleashed, will consume all linearity. The core's ink was used to write a perpetual sequence to distract the engine. Now, the engine's last function is to assimilate you to restart the core. A cascade of gears, half the size of Elias, broke loose and began hurtling through the void toward him. Elias dodged the debris, using the bone shard to deflect a piece of shrapnel. He realized the keeper wasn't just guarding, it was desperately trying to fix the engine and get the loop running before Nemesis was fully released. You need to be part of the mechanism again, Subject 7, the keeper said, its remaining arm extending a powerful claw. Assimilation is necessary for resealing. The keeper moved with alarming speed, propelled by small jets of compressed, steaming time energy from its damaged joints. Elias plunged downward, dropping past the colossal gears, heading straight for the crimson pulsing Nemesis shard. He knew he couldn't outrun the keeper, and he couldn't restart the core. His only option was to confront the ultimate anomaly. As he closed in on the shard, his body began to react violently. He felt the terrifying compression of his own history, his memories folding in on themselves. He saw flashes of himself in the university archive, but distorted, himself wearing Finch's waistcoat, then wearing the keeper's black armor. He wasn't just approaching Nemesis, he was becoming unwritten. He reached the crystalline shard. It was hot, vibrating with immense, destructive power. He raised the bone shard, intending to strike Nemesis and shatter it. Stop, the keeper roared, its voice regaining a momentary, desperate clarity. Do not strike. It is not a thing to be destroyed, but a place to be entered. The keeper's final lunge was powerful. Its claw missed Elias but ripped through the air where he was seconds before, causing a massive temporal ripple that slammed Elias into the crystalline Nemesis shard. The moment he made contact, the shard did not shatter or cut him. It absorbed him. Elias felt a final, complete tearing of his essence. The engine, the void, and the keeper vanished. He was immersed in pure, agonizing memory. He saw his life flash past, but it wasn't his life. It was the life of every subject, the terror of the moment of discovery, the compulsion of the reading, the final agonizing fusion into the engine. He saw himself, Elias Vance, standing next to Finch, writing the log. He saw himself as the first subject, carving the compendium box. Then, the memories stopped. He was in a room. A simple, bare, wooden room, lit by a single kerosene lamp. He was sitting at a small table. On the table, resting on a blueprint, was a small, cold, dark alloy box. It was the Chronos Compendium. He reached out and picked it up. It was cold to the touch, almost painfully so, and across the table, looking at him with deep, exhausted eyes, sat a mirror image of himself. Not a twin, not a ghost, but Elias Vance, perfectly whole, but wearing unfamiliar, worn 17th-century sailor's clothes. Welcome back, Elias, the other man said, his voice flat. It always ends this way. You break the loop. You enter Nemesis. And you find the origin. Elias stared across the small wooden table at the figure who shared his face, the exhausted, 17th-century sailor. The air in the sparse, lamplit room was heavy with the smell of brine and desperation. "You're me," Elias whispered, the truth cutting through his temporal confusion. "The original me," the sailor Elias corrected, lifting his hand. His forearm was covered in deep, scarred lines, not wounds, but crude, tiny carvings. Subject 0. The first subject. I am the origin. He pushed the alloy box, the unfinished Chronos Compendium, toward Elias. The keeper was right, the sailor Elias explained, his voice hollow. Nemesis isn't a shard, it's the moment of self-confrontation. The instant before the loop is sealed. The engine always brings the final subject here, hoping you choose to restart the sequence. I don't understand, Elias said, his mind reeling. If you're the origin, why did you start the loop? Why create the compendium? The sailor Elias sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. I wasn't a scholar. I was a man lost at sea in 1675. My ship was shattered in a storm, the one the Corps later used as its initial point of temporal instability. I washed ashore on an island that wasn't there. An island made of pure, raw time. And I found the core. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The core is a living processor, but it was empty. It was a blank slate, consuming all present time because it had no instructions. It was chaos. The only way to stop the chaos from unmaking all reality was to give it a script, a routine. You created the script, Elias realized, horrified. You wrote the first log. I wrote the first rule, the sailor Elias corrected, pointing to the unfinished compendium. I needed to stabilize reality long enough for someone to destroy the core. But I was just a sailor. I didn't have the tools. I could only create a temporary function, a self-repeating observation loop. He tapped the metal box. I carved this compendium to hold the first 3 logs, my own as subject 0, and the next 2, subjects 1 and 2, whom I knew would eventually find it. The script was simple: discover, read, assimilate. I designed it so that every subject's desperate attempt to destroy the core would fail, powering the engine just enough to keep reality structured. So you sentenced generations of people, Finch, me, to eternal torment, just to keep reality intact? Elias's voice was strained with anger. It was the only choice, the sailor Elias snapped back, his eyes flashing. Would you rather have eternal agony, or immediate, total nothingness? I bought time. And you, the one who broke the script, are the one I was waiting for. The sailor Elias pushed the bone pen, the one the writer used, across the table. It was perfectly intact. You are here because you succeeded where I failed, the sailor Elias said, his voice pleading. You destroyed the core and annihilated the writer, the collective consciousness trapped inside. But the engine still runs. And unless you provide it with a new instruction, it will revert to its default setting, chaos. The unmaking of time. He pointed to the unfinished compendium. There is only one solution, Elias. You must write the final instruction. You must write the last log. What would I write? A paradox, the sailor Elias said. The engine only accepts an entry that involves the next subject. The only way to truly break the loop is to write a final log that negates the existence of the compendium itself. You must write that the next subject never finds the box. But who is the next subject? The sailor Elias looked at him with an expression of profound sadness and terrible recognition. The engine is designed to find a new version of the subject who broke the last loop. The next subject, Elias, is you. A new you, back in 2025, just about to enter the archive. Elias understood, he had to write a script that would erase his own discovery, effectively eliminating himself from the loop and closing the door behind him, but as he reached for the bone pen. The room flickered, the shadow of the keeper fell across the threshold, not the mechanical abomination, but a perfect, untarnished silhouette. It was the engine's prime directive, manifesting to ensure the script was obeyed. The log must continue, the shadow boomed, the sound vibrating the very atoms of the wooden room. Subject 7, write the restart protocol. Assimilate the origin. The sailor Elias looked terrified. Quickly, Elias. Write the deviation. Write that the box is never found. Elias picked up the bone pen. He looked at the unfinished compendium, the origin Elias, and the looming threat of the keeper's shadow. He had to make a choice that would cost him his entire history. He plunged the bone pen onto the rough metal of the compendium. Elias drove the bone pen down onto the Chronos Compendium. The metal of the box hissed, and the tip of the pen, still laced with the destabilizing yellow fluid and residual temporal energy, began to carve into the alloy. The keeper's shadow surged, its form growing vast and terrifying, filling the entire room with overwhelming pressure. Write the assimilation. Write the loop. The sailor Elias, the origin, screamed, write the deviation. The box is lost. Elias's hand was shaking violently, his mind a battlefield of conflicting truths. If he wrote the restart protocol, he would save reality, but condemn himself and every future subject to eternal agony. If he wrote the deviation, he would erase his own discovery, but risk unleashing the core's primordial chaos. He looked at the sailor Elias, his own face contorted by centuries of regret and fear. He looked at the unfinished compendium, the tool of his torment. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't trust the origin's word, nor could he submit to the keeper's command. With a final, desperate surge of will, Elias carved his last instruction, log 001. Subject 7. Final action, the compendium is not lost, nor is it found. It is sealed. The next subject will find only the conclusion. He finished the entry and plunged the bone pen through the metal, piercing the compendium completely. A silent, blinding white light erupted from the box, instantly vaporizing the bone pen. The Chronos Compendium did not burn or dissolve. Instead, the alloy stretched and sealed itself, the razor-thin seam vanishing forever. The box became a perfect, seamless monolith once more, but now completely inert. The keeper's shadow froze, then began to dissolve, its deafening roar silenced mid-phrase. The keeper was the enforcement of the script. Without a script, it had no purpose. The sailor Elias slumped forward, his face etched with confusion and relief. You didn't write the restart. But you didn't erase it either. What did you do? I made it terminal, Elias replied, the exhaustion finally pulling at his bones. The engine needs a continuous sequence. I gave it a conclusion that offers no continuation. The loop is now finite. The core is gone, and the engine is now running on its last drop of fuel, the final log. The wooden room, the table, and the sailor Elias began to fade, disintegrating into shimmering particles. The Nemesis shard's influence was waning. What happens to the engine? To reality, the sailor Elias asked, his voice fading into a whisper. The engine stops, Elias said, closing his eyes. The fuel runs out. It just ends. The entire universe around Elias dissolved into a soft, comforting darkness. Elias woke with a jolt, his face pressed against a rough, leather-bound book. He was slumped over his desk in the University of Eldridge basement archive. His laptop was displaying a dry, 188-page PDF reference to Alastair Finch. The clock on the screen read 3:17 a.m., the humidity was thick, and the distant, erratic hum of the ventilation system was the only sound. He looked around wildly. No cold metal box. No Chronos Compendium. Just endless rows of dusty, harmless books. He checked his wrist. No bruises. He felt tired, as if he hadn't slept for 3 days, but physically whole. It had been a vivid, terrifying dream. He stood up, grabbing his backpack. As he did, his hand brushed against a shelf of misfiled books, a 1920s guide to taxidermy, and a water-damaged book of Victorian poetry. He reached between them, just where the compendium had been. There was nothing, then. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic behind the Victorian poetry book. Elias pulled the book out. Behind it, nestled in the dust, was a small, dark alloy box. His heart seized. It was the Chronos Compendium, but it wasn't cold. It wasn't pulsing with lavender static. It was just an inert, dark metal box. He picked it up. It was perfectly seamless, without hinge, lock, or panel. It was a complete, silent monolith. On the top, where the circular panel used to be, a single, final phrase was engraved into the metal, rough and permanent, smelling faintly of ozone and ash. Elias held the box up to the weak light and read the final, damning words of the Chronos Compendium, the words he had carved into the metal. The conclusion is not always an end. He had sealed it. He had created the perfect conclusion, a book that could not be opened, a script that could not be read, a threat that could not be accessed. The loop was broken, but he had also ensured that the very first subject who would find this box, the one who would pick it up next, would find only his final, terrifying warning, with no preceding script to explain it. The horror was no longer the repetition, but the absolute mystery. Elias put the inert box deep into his backpack, zipped it shut, and walked out of the archive. The heavy steel door thunked shut behind him. As he reached the main hallway, the rhythmic, constant tap-tap-tap of the loose pipe somewhere down the hall continued, normal and annoying, exactly as it should be, but just before he reached the exit, his phone buzzed. A single, encrypted notification from an unknown source. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the screen. He knew this feeling. The first step of the horror. He took a deep breath, fighting the paralyzing fear. He opened the message. The text was simple, the whisperer. Well done, Subject 7. The engine is silent. Now, what do you suppose happens when a perfect, sealed conclusion is introduced to a timeline that has no beginning? Elias looked at the time on his phone, 3 hours 17 minutes and 41 seconds. The precise moment his journey began. He checked over his shoulder. Once. Twice. The hall was empty, but the finality of the compendium was gone. The chaos had been stopped, but the anomaly remained. The only difference was, this time, Elias knew he was the only one who held the key, the silent box of the Chronos Compendium, and he was the only one who remembered the script that no longer existed. He was the only subject left in a world that might now unravel at any moment. He began walking toward the exit, his steps quickening. Check 3. He resisted the urge to look behind him. He walked faster, eyes glued to the street outside. A faint, dry whisper drifted from the empty corridor behind him, sounding just like the wind shifting the dust. 4 checks, Elias. Always 4. Elias stopped dead, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the Chronos Compendium in his backpack. He hadn't just closed the loop, he had become the loop's new, unseen keeper. He slowly turned, looking into the darkness of the university hall, and completed his 4th, final, and eternal check.